People are starting to look at viruses now as far as healthy corals are concerned. As far as disease is concerned, it's still in its infancy. But people have found that corals get herpes. So that's a slight problem for them. And now we're starting to put this together. This is a little schematic which is starting to think about the holobont as a whole and how all these different microorganisms affect these different corals. So up on the green one, you've got a nice healthy coral on the top right side. And viruses, this is a bacteriophage, which is a virus, can be useful for a coral as well. In this instance, it's helping dominant healthy microorganisms, dominant healthy bacteria, but it's keeping minor groups and pathogenic groups at bay. Phages attack other bacteria. Usually they attack a specific species or group, but you can get generalist phages as well. And in a natural system, they all work together quite happily. What happens when you get an increase in temperature? The phages are affected in some relatively unknown way, and they seem to switch around, and they start to attack the dominant groups of the bacteria, these healthy associates of the coral, and they start to help up the minor and the pathogenic groups, which shift the balance around, and these pathogenic species, which might be residing in low levels in the coral, or they might be coming in from other areas, things like algae, the water column itself, the sediment, and they start to increase in number and cause bleaching, necrosis, and a variety of different diseases. On top of that, you're getting attacked from the other side by the different ciliate groups. So you wouldn't really want to be a coral in today's day and age, unfortunately. Add that on top, corals also get crabs, which is a bit problematic. However, what this study did, this was by some friends in Australia, and what they did is they looked at how you could change the abundance of the number of these coral-dwelling crabs when a diseased coral was progressing. And they found if you had a large number of crabs on something like a white syndrome coral, which was progressing, it actually slowed the progressive rate. And interestingly, our theory on this is that these crabs are actually eating the ciliates. They're reducing the amount of pathogens associated with the lesion, and therefore slowing the lesion rate in total. If you reduce those natural predators, things like butterfly fish as well will probably be doing the same sort of thing. If you reduce those natural predators, put them in a tank, which is quite a lot of research is done that way, you obviously get an increase in the progression rate, and you lose some valuable data. So that's put a bit of a downer on the whole thing on how corals are going to survive. But what actually will happen with corals? What's the future? So we know there's this link between temperature, coral bleaching, coral disease, how microorganisms are affected by temperature, this effect on the viruses and how they can switch their usefulness to becoming slightly problematic. And what's the prediction? So this is from the Hadley Center of Climate Prediction and Research, famed for one of the better predictors of how things are going. And you can see the orange line is if we carried on just the way we're going for many years, and the red line is if we all reach our carbon neutral targets and all stop burning huge amounts of fossil fuels. And unfortunately, that's never going to happen. So we're humans and we like our luxuries. But you can see already that even if we did do that, it's only having a minor effect. I'm not by any means encouraging you to go out and burn everything into the sun, but it's a bit more tricky than what you normally hear in the newspapers. Added to that, we also have a 60-year lag period where we can just basically blame our parents for screwing up the environment. And even if we stopped completely using all these fossil fuels, we would still carry on in the similar trend for 60 years, and by some people's predictions earlier on, that would have been far too late for corals. But on the plus side, it's unlikely that these corals have a kind of static threshold to temperature. So this is a beautiful little graph which estimates how corals survive. So the red line is the thermal threshold of a species of coral, hypothetically, and then the orange squiggle is temperature increases. So obviously we get temperature increases on a seasonal scale anyway. Not so much in the Maldives, which is quite interesting, but in a lot of other countries we have quite huge variation in different seasons by as much as 4 to 5 degrees in certain cases. Here I think it ranges by about 2 degrees, from about 30 to 32-ish, depending on the atoll. But what you can see is that as time goes on, if the predictions increased or stuck to what is predicted, they would get a point where things like mass bleaching events, which were quite rare, now to occur maybe once every 5 years, which is what looks like they're doing now. Then it's going to occur every 2 years, and then every year, and then maybe twice a year, and again, coral reefs aren't going to look too happy. And it gets to a point where the environment just can't sustain these ecosystems. But the likelihood of that is actually quite low. And the second scenario has 3 lines on it and indicates different species variation in their threshold. So, for example, if we took the red line as acroporas are thought to be quite vulnerable, quite susceptible to bleaching and disease because of their fast-growing natures. The green one might be Poeciloperas. They might be a little bit more tolerant to different temperatures. And then the blue line might be the Porites group, the slower, massive corals, the hard ones out of there. But again, that's probably not too realistic. There's definitely some variation in colonies. There's something going on with evolution and adaptation within colonies and within specific species. So things can change, and that's where the third graph comes in, where you can see this adaptive response of corals. It goes at a slow rate. What we're doing is we're adding a huge amount of stress with all these additional stresses. So the best we can do is minimize these stress. Things like litter, pollution, they're easy things to target. Things like climate change and sea surface temperature, it's still, we can do our bit. But what we can't actually change huge amounts on a personal level. But we can just minimize other effects, overfishing, that sort of thing. And we can help these corals hopefully keep up with the rising sea surface temperatures, and they maybe adapt and evolve at a rate which will keep them sustaining. But what I believe we're going to see is just a shift, a change in dominance of different reef organisms. So we might see more of the massive corals becoming dominant, becoming the reef-building organisms which we see, and we might lose quite a few of the acroporid species. And I don't believe that's a particularly bad thing. I think that's just how nature works. We're going to start seeing shifts and changes. But again, we can do our little bit. And this graph illustrates that quite nicely. So this is on the x-axis, you've got interval of major bleaching events. So if the interval occurs after every 20 years, we're likely to see better regrowth and better recolonization. If it starts to occur more often, what's going to change? And here you can see the red line, the acropora, and you can see that if it's every 5 years, you start to get an increase. They start to recover after about 9 years or so. But then when the next one hits, they get wiped out again, and so on and so forth, and the line kind of flatlines. And that works the same with Poecilopera. Poecilopera a little bit more tolerant, a little bit less acceptable, but the overall trend appears to be the same. And then you get these two Porites species, and again, they're from the same genus, but quite different trends. But the overall trend is that they actually do better. They actually take over and seem to support the hypothesis of this changing reefs. And Porites lutea, in fact, actually starts to do very well and might become the dominant coral you find in your reef systems in the not too distant future. But then we also add this into the mix. So as I've already said, these massive corals are thought to be the more tolerant species, and these acroporas are thought to be the more susceptible, and they're supposed to bleach. And then James Guest, another friend of mine who's been working in Singapore, wrote this paper. This was just an observational study, but as you can clearly see, All the acroporids here have bleached. This was back in 2010, but then on a different site, you've got acroporids growing on top of these massive parietes, exposed to exactly the same stress, but the parietes bleach paper white, whilst the acroporids have formed some form of adaptation or resistance, and they're perfectly healthy. So nature finds a way, to use that old cliche, and I believe reefs are actually going to be okay. I'm not so pessimistic. They're under quite a lot of threats, but they're quite tolerant and they're quite hardy creatures. They can resist being prodded and touched, and I think no more than researchers themselves. We cause a lot of destruction out there by chopping off little frags and trying to kill them, and quite often I got called Dr. Death once for killing lots of different corals, bless them, but they died in the name of science. And all this added information is starting to give us a greater picture of what's actually happening, and hopefully we can come up with a better way of managing and mitigating these stresses to reduce overall pressure on corals and keep a good, healthy system. So that's it. Thank you very much.